wake up in the dark. Your boots are soaked, your uniform is covered in mud, and somewhere beyond the trench, enemy artillery is already firing. You don't know when the next shell will hit, or whether you'll see home again. This was ordinary life for soldiers on the Western Front during World War I. For months, they lived in narrow trenches surrounded by mud, rats, disease, sleepless nights, and constant danger. Before we step into the trenches and discover what life was really like for these soldiers, subscribe to the channel for more lullabies of history. Now, imagine it is 1916. It is still dark. You hear the rain hitting the trench above you. You slowly open your eyes, and another day in the trenches begins. You wake up in the dark. Your boots are wet. Your uniform is covered in mud, and you can hear artillery somewhere beyond the trench. You have no idea when the next shell will land. This was not an unusual morning for a soldier on the Western Front in World War I. For millions of men, the war meant spending long periods living in narrow trenches, surrounded by mud, cold, rats, disease, and the constant possibility of death. The trenches of World War I stretched across hundreds of miles through France and Belgium. They were built to protect soldiers from enemy fire, but they were far from safe. A typical trench system contained front-line trenches, support trenches, communication trenches, dugouts, supply areas, and medical posts. Soldiers moved between them depending on their duties and the level of fighting. Life in the front line was especially difficult. The trenches were often narrow and crowded, and rain could quickly turn the ground into deep mud. Wooden boards called duck boards were placed along the bottom so soldiers did not have to stand directly in the water and mud. Even then, keeping dry was extremely difficult. Cold and wet feet were more than uncomfortable. Soldiers could develop trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold and damp conditions. Armies eventually introduced stricter rules about changing socks, drying feet, and keeping soldiers out of standing water whenever possible. But in the middle of a battle, following these rules was not always easy. Then there were the rats. Food scraps and waste attracted large numbers of them. They moved through the trenches and dugouts, especially at night. Soldiers sometimes woke to find rats near their food or equipment. Along with rats came another problem: lice. Many soldiers constantly battled infestations in their clothing and bedding. The smell of the trenches was difficult to escape. Wet earth, smoke, food, human waste, chemicals, and dead animals all mixed together. During heavy fighting, the smell could become even worse. Soldiers became accustomed to things that would have been unbearable in normal life, but the greatest danger was artillery. Artillery caused enormous numbers of casualties during World War I. A soldier might hear a distant explosion, followed by the sound of a shell rushing through the air. There was often only a few seconds to react. A direct hit could destroy part of a trench, bury soldiers, or throw metal fragments through the surrounding area. The terrifying part was that soldiers often could not see where the shells were coming from. The enemy guns might be miles away. All you could hear was the sound approaching. Then came the explosion. Afterward, soldiers had to repair the damage. Broken trench supports were replaced. Mud was cleared away. Communication lines were repaired. Equipment had to be recovered. There was rarely enough time to simply sit and recover. When the artillery stopped, another danger remained: the enemy. Between opposing trench systems was an exposed area known as no man's land. It was filled with shell craters and barbed wire. Crossing it during an attack could be extremely dangerous because machine guns, rifles, and artillery were waiting on the other side. Before an attack, soldiers often had to wait in silence for the order to move. Some checked their rifles. Others carried extra ammunition or equipment. Many thought about home. Nobody knew exactly what would happen after leaving the trench. Then the order came. Soldiers climbed up and moved across the open ground. The attack might last only minutes, but those minutes could feel much longer. Smoke, explosions, shouting, mud, and gunfire made it difficult to see or hear clearly. Some men reached the enemy position. Others were stopped before they got there. Even capturing an enemy trench did not mean the danger was over. The newly captured position could immediately come under artillery fire. Soldiers then had to defend it, repair it, and prepare for a counterattack. For this reason, much of trench warfare became a battle of endurance. Soldiers were not fighting every minute of every day. They were waiting for the next bombardment, waiting for food, waiting for orders, waiting for relief, waiting for night, and waiting to go home. That waiting could be exhausting because the danger never completely disappeared. A soldier could be eating, sleeping, writing a letter, or cleaning his rifle when the fighting suddenly began. Sleep was especially difficult. Soldiers often slept whenever they had the opportunity rather than following a normal schedule. A dugout might provide some protection, but it could still shake violently during an artillery bombardment. Food was another part of daily life. Soldiers depended heavily on military rations because supplying fresh food to the front was difficult. British soldiers, for example, commonly received items such as preserved meat, biscuits, tea, and other basic rations. Meals were simple, and during heavy fighting, even cooking could become difficult. Tea and cigarettes could provide small moments of comfort. So could letters from home. A letter might come from a mother, wife, brother, sister, or friend. For a few minutes, a soldier could feel connected to the life he had left behind. Home meant clean clothes, warm beds, familiar faces, and a world where the greatest concern was not whether an artillery shell would hit your position. Many soldiers carried photographs or small personal objects from home. These things had no military value, but they reminded soldiers that there was a life beyond the trenches. Chemical weapons added another terrifying threat. Poison gas was used in several forms during the war, including chlorine and mustard gas. Soldiers were trained to respond quickly to gas warnings and use protective masks. The fear came partly from the fact that gas could move with the wind. A quiet position could suddenly become dangerous. But gas was only one threat. Soldiers also faced snipers, machine guns, artillery, disease, accidents, and exhaustion. Even routine jobs could be dangerous. Repairing barbed wire at night could expose a soldier to enemy fire. Carrying water could make him a target. Delivering a message between trenches could be dangerous. Carrying wounded soldiers from the front could expose medical personnel to the same weapons. And through all of this, soldiers still had to maintain their equipment. A rifle had to be cleaned, boots had to be looked after, uniforms had to be repaired, ammunition had to be carried, the trench had to be maintained. These ordinary tasks became part of survival. The psychological pressure was enormous. Soldiers knew that their friends could disappear without warning. A man could share food with someone in the morning and discover that he was missing after an artillery attack. Units suffered repeated losses and were constantly reinforced with new men. Friendships could be strong, but they could also be short. Still, soldiers found ways to cope. They joked, they played cards, they smoked, they wrote letters. They talked about what they would do after the war. Some dreamed about returning to their families. Some wanted to return to their jobs. Some simply wanted to sleep in a real bed again. These small hopes mattered, because trench warfare was not only about fighting, it was about surviving a strange routine that could continue for months. Wake up, check your equipment, stand watch, eat, repair the trench, wait, listen for artillery, try to sleep, wake up again, and repeat. By the later years of the war, armies developed new weapons and tactics to break the stalemate. Tanks appeared on the battlefield. Aircraft became increasingly important, artillery tactics improved, and infantry methods changed. But for the ordinary soldier, the trench remained the center of his world. When the war finally ended in November 1918, the fighting stopped. But the experience did not simply disappear. Millions of soldiers returned home, carrying memories of the trenches. Many had lost friends. Many had been wounded. Others carried psychological scars that were difficult to explain to people who had never experienced the front. The trenches themselves would eventually disappear beneath grass, roads, farms, and rebuilt villages. But traces of the war remained underground: rusting weapons, old ammunition, broken equipment, and sometimes the remains of soldiers who had never returned home. Today, more than a century later, it is easy to look at an old photograph and forget that the men in it were standing inside a real war. They were young men who had families, dreams, fears, and plans for the future. They did not know when the war would end. They did not know whether they would survive the next bombardment. They simply woke up each day, put on their muddy boots, checked their rifles, and returned to the trench. For them, survival was not one great heroic moment. It was getting through one more day, and then waking up to face another.